behavior, and the behavior doesn't tell us about consciousness. In fact, that movement has faded away over the last couple of decades, partly because the scientists themselves found it almost impossible to exclude attributions of consciousness to animals. I mean, they tried, and if you read journals in that period, they would only talk about behavior. So if they were giving a rat an electric shock, they wouldn't say something like the shock caused pain to the rat, which was hurt and therefore tried to get away from the pain. That's all attributing mental states. They would say the rat, or more likely they would say the subject S, exhibited aversive behavior, meaning that it moved away from the source of the shock. But one of the behaviorists himself acknowledged, dealing with primates, with monkeys, that if you wanted to explain to other people working with monkeys things like, you know, watch out for this one, she has a nasty temper, or this one is really gentle and affectionate, and if you do things she likes, she'll come with you. You know, to do that in behaviorist language was almost impossible to actually convey to people what the different monkeys were like, whereas you could very simply do it in the most natural language, which attributed mental states and personality traits to the animals. So, as I say, almost nobody really defends that view, and scientists working with animals are now quite openly exploring their consciousness and the various kinds of things that they're aware of, and how that affects the way they behave. So these are reasons why we can be confident that animals, or at least many animals, are conscious. They have anatomical and physiological similarities with us. They have nervous systems that resemble ours. They behave in appropriate circumstances as we would. So in other words, if we get an electric shock, the way we behave shows important similarities with the way that a monkey or a rat will behave if we give them an electric shock. And we share an evolutionary history, which means that it would be odd if they had evolved similar nervous systems and similar kinds of behavior without there being a similar underlying basis. Not impossible, but the most natural explanation of this, the simplest explanation, is that they evolved the capacity to feel pain because that was a way of alerting danger, which might have been life-threatening, and those that developed an ability to sense that danger and to move away from it, to escape it, were more likely to survive and more likely to produce offspring. So there's good reasons why they should have a capacity for pain in similar ways to the way that we have that capacity for pain. But does this apply to all of that vast range of animals that I talked about? Well, the similarities that I talked about, the similarities of the anatomy and physiology, the similarities of behavior to some extent, and also the evolutionary distance we have from them varies according to the species or to the larger orders and so on. So if we're talking about mammals and birds, then the similarities are close, and those are the categories of beings where I think there's really no room for doubt. I mean, philosophers can always be skeptical and find a room for doubting anything, including the fact that I'm not now dreaming that I'm talking to this audience in front of me. But if we're putting aside that kind of skepticism, I don't think there's much room for doubt that animals and birds are conscious. And if you extend that to other vertebrates like fish, maybe there's just a scintilla more room for doubt, but I think there's good grounds for believing that all vertebrates are capable of feeling pain. When you get to invertebrates, there's much more variety of nervous systems. They resemble ours less, and it's harder to say for sure, hard to have the same degree of confidence that there's a capacity to feel pain. But I do think, or consciousness generally, I do think that for some of the invertebrates, that still seems overwhelmingly probable. My favorite example is the octopus, and if you go on YouTube and search for octopus and opening a jar, something like that, you get a lovely little video of an octopus which is given a sealed screw-top jar, like a peanut butter jar, in which there's some tasty morsel that the octopus likes to eat. The octopus has never seen a screw-top jar before. It's not something that it evolved to deal with, but it quite rapidly works out how to, what the jar is sort of in a way, and how to open the jar, sort of drapes itself over the top of the lid, and gets the lid off and gets the morsel out. And it's hard to imagine that it could do that if it wasn't conscious and aware of the problem that it was trying to solve. It's a novel problem. So I do think that some invertebrates, at least, are conscious. As far as crustacea, like lobster or crabs or shrimp are concerned, again, it's harder to be really certain. There's a more diverse nervous system with different nervous centers. So here I would say there is room for some real doubt. But if in doubt, and if our need for doing something that will harm the animal is not great, we might say we ought to give them the benefit of that. And finally, when you come to the bivalves, the mollusks like clams and oysters, I think the challenge becomes quite considerable. I think it's actually unlikely that they're capable of getting pain, partly because the nervous system is so rudimentary, partly because the evolutionary explanation for why pain is useful to us doesn't seem to hold so well for bivalves, which basically are immobile. They're not really able to move away from the source of the pain. So, yeah, you know, maybe they don't. That seems reasonable, but there's still some doubt, and you might want to still say, well, if there's some doubt, we ought to give them the benefit of the doubt where there's nothing too much hanging on the other side. But it's mostly in what I'm going to be talking about. I'll be focusing on the vertebrates as the core of what I want to talk about in regard to the effect we have on animals. So what are the ethical views that we hold about animals? First, it's important to realize where we come from in terms of the Western tradition. Because the Western tradition has generally, for most of the last couple of thousand years, denied any real moral status to animals. And it's important to think about this because this is the background against which we're forming our views. Aristotle is at the, well, not quite at the very beginning, but close to the beginning of Western philosophy. And he had a view of the universe in which the less rational exists for the sake of the more rational. So things exist, in other words, for a purpose. The whole universe has a purpose, which is for the more rational beings. It so happened, of course, that Aristotle himself was among the more rational beings, so it's a convenient view. Not only in that he's human and the brute beasts, as they're called here, are less rational, and therefore exist for his sake, to provide him with food and skins and things at that time, and the plants, less rational, still exist for the sake of the animals. But Aristotle even thought that the Greeks were more rational than the barbarians. So the same argument provided him with a convenient justification for slavery. And of course, we reject that argument, but to some extent we still perhaps have in part of our consciousness about animals the idea that, well, because they're less rational than us, they exist to serve us. Of course, if we accept an evolutionary account of how we came about and how the other animals came about, we know that that's simply not true. They didn't come into existence for a purpose. They came into existence as a result of random mutations and different life forms occurred and filled various niches and survived and reproduced. And that's how we're here, and that's how the other animals exist as well. There's no underlying purpose to it. But Aquinas took over a